Today we're going to talk about Texas Democrats fleeing the state to block Republicans from passing their voter suppression bill and what came of a highly anticipated meeting with Joe Manchin. And I interview one of these Texas Democrats himself, James Tallarico, about his viral interview with a Fox News host, his response to Ted Cruz's criticism, and the likelihood of he and his colleagues getting arrested if they return home. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. So yet again, Texas Democrats have been forced to break quorum, this time leaving the state during a special legislative session called by Republican Governor Greg Abbott, who is hellbent on passing his party's voter suppression bill. The Texas delegation went to Washington, D.C. to put pressure on national Democrats to pass the For the People Act, which would protect against some of the worst effects of the bill in Texas. Now, meanwhile, Texas Republicans have ordered a call of the House, which authorizes Department of Public Safety troopers in the state to arrest members of the state House who broke quorum. And Governor Abbott even said outright that they will be arrested. But so long as they're in D.C., they're safe, since Texas's troopers don't have jurisdiction outside of the state. Something else Governor Abbott did was veto the legislature's funding as a way to put pressure on these Democrats to relent and just let the bill pass. That's right, the party of small government in the state of small government just saw one branch's executive deprive the more than 2,000 employees of another branch their salaries and health insurance, all because he didn't get to pass his voter suppression bill, rigging the rules of the game for his own party. And this isn't even going to impact the lawmakers. They make $600 a month. That's what, $7,000 a year? The people this is going to impact are their staffs, the custodians, cafeteria workers, parking attendants, landscapers, and every other employee who relies on this funding to survive. That's who Abbott is using as bargaining chips until he gets what he wants. But what's most shameless about this whole process is that Republicans are rallying behind what they're branding an election integrity bill, even though labeling it an integrity bill suggests that there's some lack of integrity in the process right now, that there was some type of widespread nefarious behavior, which there wasn't. And that's not just me saying that there wasn't. The issue was litigated in more than 60 court cases, including in front of a number of judges who Trump himself appointed, and at no point in even a single case were they able to prove fraud. Trump's own DOJ and DHS said there was no fraud. Republican secretaries of state said there was no fraud. Recounts and audits confirmed that there was no fraud. So to suggest that in an election where the results were correctly counted and tabulated, that somehow, on some planet, this thing was illegitimate is to pretend that none of those things happened. And that's what this is. It's pretending. It is a coordinated effort to repeat and promote the big lie that the election was stolen, even in the absence of a modicum of evidence. Because so long as they can manipulate their supporters into believing there was fraud, they can continue using that as a pretext to pass laws that will make it more difficult for people to vote who typically cast ballots for Democrats. They are lying about an election being rigged as a justification to then rig the next election for themselves. And beyond that, just look at the bill. Banning 24-hour voting is not election integrity. Ending drive-through voting is not election integrity. Imposing new restrictions and paperwork requirements on individuals who help disabled voters and non-English speakers cast a ballot, making it harder for election officials to remove partisan poll watchers who harass and intimidate voters, and imposing criminal penalties on election officials and volunteers who commit even a minor violation of the state's election law does nothing to preserve the integrity of our elections. None of those provisions should be passed by any legislature even mildly committed to protecting voting rights. The point is making it more difficult to vote. And of course, Republicans will point to the fact that they'd removed provisions that were included in previous versions of their bill, including a provision that would have shut down a number of polling precincts where predominantly black voters live, and another that would have ended early voting on Sunday mornings when black churches sponsored their Souls to the Polls drives. And so Republicans will point to those as a sign of compromise. But it's not a compromise to just take out the single most abhorrent provisions of a bill. Taking out those provisions should be the bare minimum. Imagine someone robbing you and telling you that they want your phone and your wallet. And then they're like, look, you know what? Let's compromise. Just give me your wallet. That's not a win for you. That's just making something shitty marginally less shitty. The bill that's been reintroduced in this special session is a marginally less shitty bill, but still wholly unwarranted and unnecessary. Now, the fact that these Texas Democrats are in D.C. is the only thing preventing the Republican bill from passing, but it's not a permanent solution. Abbott has the power to call unlimited special legislative sessions, and so while it didn't work this time, he can call another one the day after this one ends. And if the Democrats flee the state that time, he can call another one after that, meaning that the situation isn't sustainable. But it was never meant to be. The whole point of this exercise is to put pressure on national Democrats who clearly aren't meeting this moment. Because here's the deal, we can screw around with our legislative priorities and win some victories in the short term, but Republicans have their attention trained on consolidating power for years beyond this. They're focused on ensuring that states are so gerrymandered that there's no way the Democrats could win the House, meaning that zero legislation gets passed ever again. And that would be the ball game, which is why every day not spent fighting back against these anti-democratic efforts is a day wasted. And that's not to say that the American Rescue Plan wasn't monumentally important, or that the American Jobs Plan or the American Families Plan aren't going to fundamentally change this country, because they will. But unless we're okay with this being the Democrats' final legislative achievement, then we need to wake the fuck up and recognize that passing an infrastructure bill isn't going to magically win us the House when Republicans have mathematically engineered congressional districts in such a way that Democrats will have the least representation humanly possible. The Texas Democrats seem to understand this, and yet somehow there are national Democrats who don't. Somehow there are national Democrats who have the power to do something to quite literally save this country from the greatest threat to democracy in our lifetime, and their priority is some arcane Senate procedural tool and the non-existent promise of bipartisanship from a party that doesn't want it, from a party whose public statements sound like this.
100% of my focus is on stopping this new administration.
And yet, despite all of this, according to reporting, these Texas Democrats did meet with Joe Manchin on Thursday, and he shot down the prospect of a carve-out to the filibuster for voting rights legislation, insisting instead that some iteration of the voting rights bill could pass with 60 votes. He suggested the reason that the For the People Act failed to get 60 votes when it was introduced before was that it was too comprehensive. He said, quote, they had a bill that's 800 pages long, they've had everything thrown at them. And so he's calling for a more bare-bones legislation instead. Now, why Joe Manchin thinks that Republicans would support anything substantive is beyond me, when they are quite literally the instigators of this anti-democratic legislation. It's like partnering with termites to protect wood. And yet, with that said, our only option right now is to continue pushing this. That's it. We have a 50-50 Senate, and Manchin is number 50. But we won't get there without trying, so good on these Texas Democrats for forcing the issue. If what it takes is an entire delegation of Democrats who've left behind their families and homes and jobs to finally force these holdouts to at least pay attention, to at least take a meeting, then so be it. And at a time when the coming months will determine what this country looks like for a decade or more, the importance of what they're doing can't be overstated. But with that said, it's not free to have flown to DC. It's not free to live in a hotel. It's not free to feed an entire delegation of people every day. And at a salary, again, of $600 a month, these Texas Democrats can't do this alone. I started an Act Blue this past week to raise money for the Texas House Democratic Campaign Committee. I'll put a link in the post description, so if you recognize just how important what these people are doing, then please help support them. Because right now, this is far and away the most significant fight we're facing, and the people fighting it need our help. To listen to my interview with one of these Texas Democrats himself, James Tallarico, about his viral interview with a Fox News host, his response to Ted Cruz's criticism, and the likelihood of him and his colleagues getting arrested if they return home, check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel.